Good afternoon, everyone. This is Maria Campbell at UKSG, welcoming you to this afternoon's UKSG webinar on open science services. I'd like to welcome all registrants, if you're on the live event or indeed catching up via the recording. And welcome to the start of the autumn webinar programme, which will take us all the way up till Christmas. So I hope you can join us for these monthly presentations on various subjects. I'd like to welcome our two speakers this afternoon. We have David Walters and Chris Daley from Brunel University. Hello, both.
Hello.
We've been having a nice little chat beforehand, and it's really interesting, David and Chris. You were telling me a little bit about how you came to conceive this study and to go for it, really. It seems quite ambitious from my point of view. So what prompted you to undertake it?
So hello everyone, I hope you can all hear me well. My name's Christopher Daley. So what really prompted us is that we both worked in the scholarly communications team in the library at Brunel University, and I was dealing with HEFG's OA policy, so managing kind of green open access, if you will, and David was in charge of APCs and dealing with gold open access. And what we noticed was, for example, there would be a researcher who contacted me as soon as their publication was accepted and said, oh, I've got to make sure I put this in the repository to remain compliant for the REF. And I'd go, okay, yeah, I'll help you with that. And then maybe 2 months later or so, that you'd find out that this researcher was actually funded by, say, you know, the BBSRC or something, and would contact David and say, oh, I've got to make this gold to be compliant with my funder. And we kind of thought there's quite a lot of overlap here and a lot of confusion amongst academics around these policies. And we also wondered whether there was quite a lot of duplication of effort, because there's lots of co-authors on a lot of these papers. And we wondered if the same conversations and the same things were taking place at individual institutions, and whether, you know, the way we were recording and monitoring open access compliance was actually incredibly inefficient and causing a massive duplication of effort. And is there a way we can sort of look at this and see if there's a duplication of effort that's occurring? And are there some services that will help us get kind of better data that goes outside of institutional systems? So that's how the work came about, and we thought, let's collaborate, let's write a journal article and do some presentations about this.
So, and here we are today, which is our pleasure completely. Before we get to the presentation, we'd just like to take the participants through a how to participate slide, which you should be able to see up on screen now. On the right of your screen, you'll be able to see your control panel, and you can either use the white arrow on the orange button to open and close it, or to keep it open permanently, you can click the view menu and untick auto hide control panel. The Earth drop down will give you some language options. And then for the audio, most of you will have joined using your computer speakers and Wi-Fi. I hope that gives you a good enough connection. Sometimes Wi-Fi can drop in and out, so if that does happen, you might want to either refresh the screen, or if it's too bad, you can leave and then rejoin and hope for a better connection. Or indeed, you can choose to switch to telephone and dial in using the information provided. We're going to take all the questions at the end of the presentations, but feel free to write them in at any point during the presentation, and we'll just keep those loaded for the end. We're going to use the webcam towards the end during Q&A, I think, so we can actually get a look at Chris and David. And similarly, if there are any problems throughout the presentation, just pop your query into the question box and I'll try and get to that as quickly as I can. So Chris and David, we agreed a couple of polls to take the pulse, as it were, of the audience that we have with us today. So up on screen, you'll be able to see the question, have you heard of OA data services such as Unpaywall, Core and Sherpa REF? And if you'd like to select the option that applies, we're not going to give you terribly long for this because we think we know how it's going to go, but actually it's looking more evenly spread than I expected. So a couple more seconds and I'm going to close the poll and share the answers. So Chris and David, we have 47% have heard of all of those services. 44% some of them, and a 9% on none of them. And we're just going to quickly take another poll to find out which of those services you actually use. So again, we're looking to find out your usage of these services. And we'll give you a few more seconds here. I'm going to find out which the most popular is. A few more seconds, and I'm going to close the poll and share the results. So we have 55% use Unpaywall, the Unpaywall browser extension. 22% use Core or Core's API. 5% use Lantern's OA spreadsheet service, and 40% use Sherpa REF. So, Chris and David, is that what you would expect? Is that in line with your findings?
Yes, no, I think that's quite interesting. I think our experience, and part of the reason why we took the study, was that a lot of the library systems that we use aren't integrated with a lot of these new and emerging services. So a lot of them do have sort of web interfaces as well as these API services, which we'll go on to talk about a bit more in the presentation. So I would expect there to be maybe some use, and I think that's what those results show, which is quite interesting.
I mean, it's also good to know, sorry, 1 second. It's also good to know that quite a lot of people are also, I think really 90% or so are actually have kind of heard of these services as well, which is really good to hear. Excellent. So thank you everyone for completing those polls. That gives us a really good sense of the audience this afternoon. So I can see the slides are up, Chris and David, so over to you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Maria, for your kind introduction there. So once again, I'll say that my name is Christopher Daley. I'm Research Development Officer at Brunel University London. I'm actually based in the research office, and I'm joined by my colleague David Walters, who is Open Access Officer, and David's based in the library. So today we're going to talk about how emerging open science services can enhance institutional publication data. So I think we'll dive straight into the contents of the talk. So what we're going to talk about first of all is I'm going to provide you with an introduction to the UK policy landscape. I imagine quite a lot of you are quite familiar with this landscape, so it'll be quite quick. The thing I do want to flag up here is some of the policy concerns that possible concerns we have around the policies, and also reflect some of the concerns amongst the scholarly communications community as well about it that have recently sprung up. I'll also give you a quick introduction to the global policy environment as well, very, very briefly, before handing over to David, who will talk you through the kind of technology landscape that goes alongside this policy landscape, and talk about some of the OA data services that we have used for our study. And David will also talk a little bit more about how these resources have allowed for the global state of OA to be examined, before we then present you with the results of our study that we recently undertook in the last year. And I'll finish off with a conclusion, which will be a bit more discussion about the results. And also, because we know that some people are interested in this, to talk very briefly about Plan S by the European Union as well, to finish with. Okay, so just to run through the learning outcomes, you've probably seen these already. So hopefully by the end of this, you'll actually have a wider understanding of the current OA policies in the UK. You may already be quite well versed in this, but hopefully you'll maybe know a little bit more. We'll also hopefully provide you with an understanding and overview of the major services that are looking to aggregate OA data. And finally, also an understanding of what this means for institutional systems and for people who are monitoring open access compliance as well, and the potentiality for interoperability in the future. Okay, so I'll go straight in to talk about the UK policy environment then. So many of you will be familiar with this, but I know there's a kind of wide audience, many people from around the globe who are going to be listening. So the 2012 Finch report is often seen as an important moment in the implementation of OA policies in the UK, and this report recommended support for gold open access models. These recommendations were then picked up by UKRI, as it's now known, who have a strong preference for gold for research funded by the UK research councils. Interestingly, a number of charities as well, such as the Wellcome Trust, also mandate for gold. However, what we find quite interesting is this bit, that Research England, who administer the UK's Research Excellence Framework, otherwise known as REF, also have a mandate which requires all researchers to make their journal articles and publish conference papers available via the green route to remain compliant for the next REF. So as you can see, there's strong support for both routes to OA within the UK context. However, you might already sense that these overlapping policies may cause some confusion amongst academics and possibly lead to duplication, which more on this later when David speaks. In case any of you are unfamiliar with the REF, this is a system for assessing the quality of research in UK higher education institutions. Institutions submit their best research outputs and impact case studies and are awarded research funding. It's a competitive exercise between institutions. Okay, so that's just a very brief overview of the UK policy context there. To just talk a little bit more about this and to talk about the effects of these policies, which have been quite noticeable and rapid. And there are two reports that have recently discovered evidence of this. So the report that's outlined on the left of the slide here is by Universities UK, which found that 37% of UK publications, this is just journal articles is what they're actually looking at, were OA in 2016. So this is just simply looking at works which are fully open access on publication. Universities UK also found that over 50% of publications were available within 12 months of publication. So for green publications, this was obviously after an embargo period. The report on the right of the slide is by Research England from June this year, and this found that 80% of outputs complied with their policy for the next REF. You'll remember that they preferenced the green route, or had registered one of their quite generous, I must say, exceptions. And as they state in their report, this is Research England, this is a significant achievement, and it's good to see such increases in OA in the UK. However, as staff who've been involved in the implementation of the policy, as well as being OA advocates ourselves, we've noticed a number of things about such a mandate and compliance-based approach that maybe concern us a little bit. And this is something that hopefully we can discuss further in the Q&A. But I'm going to run through a couple of these concerns now. So the first worry we have is that the policy landscape is creating a situation where both academics and institutions start to see OA purely in relation to compliance levels. So academics often say to us, we've often come across this, oh yes, I have to make this open access, don't I, so that I can be compliant for the REF. Or more worryingly, they might say something like, oh, I can't be bothered to make this paper OA because I'm not going to submit it to the REF anyway. The other concern is that institutions become obsessed with compliance levels, which kind of is understandable given the policy environment, but forget that the broader aim of open access and open scholarship, which involves using open material to widen engagement with publics beyond institutional walls. So the second concern, the additional concern that we have is we've been quite concerned that in order to comply with government policies on OAs, institutions have become so tightly focused on their own institutional systems that they have been ignoring the kind of wider OA practices of co-authors or the use of other compliant systems such as disciplinary repositories. This may lead to the same task then being undertaken multiple times. So this might be depositing in a compliant repository, for example, and also a situation where authors and co-authors are being asked multiple times to do this by research support services. And really, OA only needs to take place once to ensure compliance. And we'll talk about this a little bit further and issues around duplication when we come on to the results of our study. But it's just first quickly pointing out that in recent months, actually, a number of people have started to say things that are similar to us. It's made us think we're not completely mad. There are other people out there who think this as well. So it's interesting to note that a few prominent figures in scholarly communications have started to express some concerns about the ultimate goal of these policies. Indeed, it's interesting to see that these people are concerned that OA mandates do not necessarily connect with broader cultures of openness or necessarily incentivize academics to develop their own open cultures. This is particularly highlighted in a recent blog by Elizabeth Gadd, where she says that, to my mind, we've rushed too quickly into with policy demands, instead of providing the mechanisms by which academic communities could form their own flavour of openness. Similarly, Danny Kingsley has asked the question, what we are not measuring, or indeed even discussing, is the reason why we are doing this. So why are we following the green route, for example, with Research England? Why are we putting things onto institutional repositories? No one's asking those questions, and no one's talking to academics about why we're doing this. It's just simply about compliance. And the question, and as Cameron Nayland pointed out to us, he came along to our OA conference at Brunel in 2016. You could say that at the moment we are simply tossing library books or journals over a campus wall and hoping that publics will pick them up. Sorry, I received a message. I just kind of stopped briefly then, thinking that I'd lost connection, but I think I'm still there. So he said that we kind of are simply tossing library books over the kind of journal or journals over a campus wall and hoping that publics will pick them up. The actual challenge really is to try and break down these institutional walls. So just to move on to finally onto the global policy context then. So sorry, I've gone one slide too many. So the global OA policy environment is also worth just briefly mentioning here. So David's going to talk about the global state of OA later and big studies which have examined the levels of OA. It is, however, important to note what we might call called the global OA policy stack, as we name it, where we have seen a rapid rise in OA policies by institutions, national bodies and international bodies over the last 10 to 15 years. And so this is in many respects very positive to see this kind of exponential rise, as OA has been embedded within a range of scholarly organisations. But the question remains as to whether we have seen a concurrent rise in the emergence of open scholarship practices across disciplines, or whether old rigid scholarly structures remain unchanged in some areas. So at that point, I'm going to pass you over to David to talk a bit more about the technology landscape, and I'll come back later. So bye for now, and here's David.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Okay, yes, so alongside these recent policy developments, there's also been a growth in technology services. So in our study, we broadly refer to these as open science services. These are typically global platforms used by researchers and university staff to support the research process and facilitate collaboration and dissemination. The 101 Innovations in Scholarly Communication project documents many of these open science services. They also detail the application of tools and services within various research life cycles and workflows. Some of these innovations are run by publishers and other private entities. Others are publicly maintained and led by research communities and libraries. Often, REST interfaces enable programmatic access to these resources, which maximizes the potential for reuse and the application of the data. And as we'll show you later in our research, data from these services can be used to provide insights into OA publishing and scholarship. But the most useful of these services do have a function or purpose within the academic research lifecycle. This ensures they're well used and can therefore also provide a good insight into research activity within their domain. At this point, I think it's worth touching upon open science more generally. Open access is not supposed to be an end in and of itself. There is a much bigger framework emerging to support the modern research environment, commonly referred to as open science. This area is particularly being championed by the EU. Open science includes initiatives in open peer review, open data, open education. And in this context, the technology landscape may provide a means for research organisations to reward international and collaborative engagement with open science practices. However, the landscape requires incentives for cultural change to open access on this journey towards open science. So let's get into some of the open science services that are available that can help institutions to identify OA publications and data. So in our research, we selected just 3 of these services to provide data for our study: Sherpa REF, Unpaywall, and Core. And as I said, very interesting to see current usage at the beginning of the talk. Sherpa REF resources indicate possible OA locations from serial policies, and it's primarily used by UK institutions to support REF compliance workflows. So there's a web interface that allows you to do that. Unpaywall and Core services aggregate information on OA content and locations. For example, outputs hosted by institutional repository systems and publisher platforms. We chose these services because of the size and type of the data holdings, our confidence in the quality of the data. Unpaywall and Core are regularly used in mainstream research and information system tools. You'll also note that all these services serve a different primary function within the research landscape, and there's a range of clients, range of different means of accessing this underlying data. So they all implement a free REST API for wider consumption, and I would definitely recommend taking a look at JISC's recent blog, comparing Core to a range of other OA aggregators for a more complete summation of some services that hold data on OA. So on the back of that slide, some of you might now be asking just exactly what is a REST API. So in this section, we'll attempt to provide you with a simple summary and offer some practical examples from those open science services we used in our study. So in some ways, REST is very simple because it's using existing internet technologies and behaves in ways that we're all familiar with when we're using the web. For example, a client makes a request to a web server over HTTP. The server processes the request and responds by serving a web page, an image, or whatever it is the client has actually requested. Or if you're very unlucky, you might receive a 404 response code, meaning that the web service is down. So REST works very much in the same way. It's an architectural style that encompasses the common web standards such as HTTP, URL, HTML, and XML. And in terms of delivering web services, REST aims to ensure that these services retain the benefits of the design of the web in terms of being loosely coupled, hugely scalable, open standards based, and vendor independent technologies without introducing further complexity, constraints, or weaknesses. So really, REST is based on a re-examination of the technologies that have already made the web such a success. It's an observation that these technologies can be used directly to support web services without the need for any additional mechanisms. So it's not a standard in itself, it's not a new technology, it's a style or a different approach to implementing web services. So when RESTful web services are written, these same standards are being used to make data available for machines as well as humans. So the term was originally coined by Roy Fielding in his PhD dissertation to describe an architectural style of systems, networking, that did not require any additional mechanisms or protocols over and above existing standards. So quoting from his thesis, he described REST behavior as that of any well-designed web application, a network of web pages that provides links or state transitions that result in the next page being sent to the user. So some champion REST as a second-generation approach to web services. SOAP is another quite dominant web service technology, but this is a standard that's defined by the World Wide Web Consortium. So developers that are using SOAP need to learn the details of that standard in order to implement it. So that's not the case with REST because it uses these existing technologies in order to function, and these were actually developed first alongside the internet. So XML, SOAP, and other standards are in fact later approaches. So this so-called second generation of web service is in fact simply a return to using HTTP and URIs. REST is described as stateless. Each request has to complete, carrying all the required information in order to process a request. REST uses standard HTTP operations, for example, GET, which is the request type most commonly used by your browser when retrieving web pages. REST resources are uniquely defined or identified, by URIs. Clients, software components, for example, can be used to manipulate these resources. One resource might contain URIs to other related resources. So REST is not concerned at all with how it's actually implemented. It's based really on the concept of a resource, a piece of data that's accessible anytime over a network. Each resource is defined by its own unique address and a representation that's yielded by that address. So the address of any resource in the internet is given by a URI. But it's worth bearing in mind that it's not actually necessary for any URI to actually exist as a web page. The web server, can intercept the request to a path and reply with some form of dynamic content. So just like a URL, an infinite number of URIs can be used for these purposes. And it's this dynamic handling of requests that makes it easier to support the REST model for delivering web services. The client requesting any URI receives a response that places the client in either a new or a fresh state. That's the idea behind REST providing web services. And this can be thought of in terms of the client receiving a web page that reveals a new set of links to other resources or other web pages. And from this new state, the client can select another link, and by taking that path, cross over to another page or state that reveals more links to further pages and states. The view of web services reduces the model to a very simple set of concepts: state, transition, and the transport protocol that allows the transitions to be navigated by clients. So of course, mapping this view to the internet becomes quite simple. The state is simply an HTTP response, page and content. A transition is a state that's accessible from the current state, for example, another URI available in the current state, and the underlying transport protocol is simply HTTP. So let's take this really simple example of a REST-based web service. So I've given an example here of a REST resource at example.com/lightbulb, which is just a representation of a light bulb. So the resource is uniquely located at this URI. So in this API, let's imagine that it has functions to allow a client to turn the light bulb on and off and to check the state. So if we consider that case of a light switch that wants to convey some of this information to the light, whether to be on or off. Perhaps this will give some of you a light bulb moment as well. So we could think of an on-off instruction as being a simple Boolean value, true or false, and we could use an HTTP put method to send requests to that light. So to turn the light on, for example, we could use put true to the resource. To turn the light off, we could use put false to that resource. And then to determine whether the light is on or off, we could then use a standard HTTP get method, get resource, which returns the data regarding its state, for example, whether it's true or false. So just to quickly summarize this section, REST is a stateless methodology or style transported via HTTP or HTTPS. A request is transported as a URI. Response data can be XML, JSON, or other text-based methods. An analysis of the URI and HTTP method indicate intent, which can then be processed by the server application. So let's jump straight in with a really simple real-life example with an OA web service. So Sherpa REF at the moment has quite a simple API. You pass it a resource, in this case an ISSN, and it will return some data about that resource. So I'm just going to try and change my screen now. So let's see if this works. Okay, I hope you can all see that. So this is the web page for the Sherpa REF API, and they very helpfully have a little example down here. So you have the API location, and then you have the resource, which is the ISSN at the end. So they've got an example for the publication nature. So if I enter that into the browser does a GET request, and it comes back with some data here. So this data here is in a JSON format. So it looks a bit complicated, but you have to remember that the provider is obviously, has data to send you, and it's structuring it in a way that it thinks it's logical. But that can be consumed by, software or a program that you develop. Okay, so let's try and go back to the presentation. Okay, I think we're back in the room. Okay, yeah, so from that, some of you might now be asking exactly what is JSON. So again, I'll give you a very brief overview here and then some practical examples from the core service. So when considering REST, We also need to consider JSON as a lightweight data interchange format that's also been widely adopted. This is a very easy to understand text-based format that's frequently used in conjunction with REST APIs. The format is very compact, which makes it very easy for computers and people to read and write. So in terms of web applications, we can think of JSON as an alternative data interchange format to XML. In recent years, and partly because of its close links with JavaScript, JSON has become an accepted and popular alternative means to exchange data. Whilst XML is a tried and tested technology and is already used in a huge range of applications, but JSON has advantages in that it tends to be more compact than XML, it understands JavaScript, and some would argue it's easier to read and write. But these arguments aren't quite as clear as they should be. So in any different service, if developing a web service yourself, different technologies offer different opportunities, and the reasons why one is perhaps adopted at the expense of another will often be driven by the functional requirements of that application, or it will come from the preferred skill sets and approaches of particular web service designers. But another advantage of JSON over XML is being closely based on the JavaScript notation. It's a very familiar sort of format in terms of the creation of arrays and objects particularly, which means that rather than using a parser, you can simply use standard JavaScript functions to convert JSON data into native JavaScript objects. So a good case of this is if you develop an application using HTML5, for example, this becomes quite a useful advantage. There's less work to be done. So the data maps very easily onto these data structures, which are used by most programming languages, numbers and strings, booleans, etc. And once you've created your message, your JSON message, it's easy to send it to another application or computer because it's just plain text, just like we showed there with the Sherpa REF API. So many programming languages contain functions or libraries that can read or write JSON structures. So now we'll move on to another practical example using the core service. So core, as we sort of touched on, is a huge resource holding OA data and full text for text and data mining services. And the data is accessible by the core search engine and via their API. So to use the core API, you have to register for a key, which you then pass to the service via the URI along with the request for the resource. This is just a mechanism that helps core to control usage. So it only takes a couple of seconds and just involves filling out an online form. If you're developing an application, you have to respect the API's limits, which I think is something like one request every 10 seconds. But of course, if you need something more than this, you can contact the team or use their data dumps. So let's have a look at their API documentation. Again, I'll just attempt to change the screen again. Okay, so this is the web page with the documentation for the API. So you see here they've got a whole range of operations that they've implemented for users. So you can see broadly the API accepts post and get requests. You're able to access masses of data out, by making bulk requests, or you can make queries based virtually on any data attribute held in their repository and article holdings. So we'll just quickly look at operations for retrieving articles and make a simple query using a GET request. So this gives you an overview of the structure of the data that's going to be returned. I'm just going to leave most of the values at default. There's a space at the bottom to put in your API key. So if we were to make a query for a DOI, for example, so let's first try DOI. So we published along with our paper all the data that we retrieved from from the various web services. So we have all the core data that we retrieved. So I'll just take a DOI from there. Oops, to be able to view it. Oops. Oops. Let's see if I can get the right one. Yeah, we'll go with this one. Nope. Yeah, here we go. So, with core, we actually also counted where article titles and where there were multiple locations. So, this one at the top was found to have the most locations according to core, 9 locations. So I'll just look it up very quickly to get the DOI. Okay, so this is the paper. Here's the DOI. Oops. And I'll just put that into the API. It just comes back. Query bit, you put in the DOI. Oops. Give it a try. And there you go. So you can see it's come back with 3 hits, three records from core, and all this data as well. So as I was saying, you can search by any parameter. So you can try again searching by title. We tried both approaches actually in our study. Having a unique identifier like a DOI obviously has its advantages though. So searching by title, oh, not found, that's not good. Ah, that's right, DOI, so change that to title. Here we go, so you can see it's come back with a number of hits, more hits going by article title. So obviously that's quite a lot of data, and obviously each URI is implemented differently. Their data structures for their data are going to be different. I find it quite helpful to use things like a JSON viewer. Oops, JSON. Like this one I use quite regularly. This is quite good. You can just paste the data that you've got if you just want to have a look at what the structure is. And you can see here you've got the JSON object and the number of hits and the data in an array here. You can see we've had 9 records returned. So let's just go through some of these. So the first record, title matches, improving the experience of dementia. This was found in LSE Research Online. Let's have a look at the second one. Second one, same paper, found in Sussex Research. And let's have a look at this one here. This one was found, the same paper again, found in King's Research Portal. So these results are obviously highly interesting, especially when you think of it in context of the collaborative OA activity that Chris was talking about earlier, especially when you're considering how institutions are requiring authors now to work towards open access. If you try looking for these papers in Google Scholar as well, you see another interesting difference that comes back. I won't do it now, but earlier we did a little scan for this paper, and we found 23 versions in Google Scholar. Obviously, these tools are really good, but they are more limited than Google's all-seeing eye. Okay, so I'll just return now to the presentation. This one? Ah. Oh, hi, Maria.
Yeah, hi.
Sorry.
I can still see the JSON viewer at the moment. Maybe try hitting the blue flower in the start bar to get you back to the right place.
Ah. Yeah. Now do it.
Here we go. Sorry, we're back on track now.
Yeah, perfect. I can see the slides.
There we go. Yeah, we're back. Okay, great. Right, let's move on. Okay, yeah. So in our research, we actually found that Core found some 1,800 locations for just over 1,000 publications. We found 370 distinct works found in multiple OA locations, so that's just over a third of papers from that sample. If you follow that link, which I've listed on the slides, you can also see a map. We plotted all those locations. It's quite impressive to see. You can see the results form really a collaborative picture that begins to emerge once institutions have access to this type of data. OA networks are spread collaboratively. and they intersect with individual researchers and institutions. So we're beginning to think from our results that there may be a tension indicated between that implementation of OA policies at a local level and the collaborative research enterprise. So in this last section, I'll touch on Unpaywall and their research into global OA levels. So this is the final service on our list, Unpaywall. They recently published a hugely insightful paper onto global levels of OA by published works with DOIs, and this paper was titled The State of OA. Quite correctly, they initially define OA at a very high level. OA is free to read online, either on the publisher website or in an OA repository. And all articles not meeting this definition were defined as closed. They found some 45% of recent work to be made available as OA, and this is a very useful global benchmark. But nonetheless, they do classify several OA subtypes, of which the most common type found was bronze OA. This was actually a new type which they coined themselves. So bronze OA is a form of publisher OA. When the work is open access, copyrights are held by the publisher. So in our paper, we distinguish between types of closed works, those closed by the publisher through a lack of an archival policy, and those closed by the author, where an archival option exists but is yet to be taken up. And we'll talk about why that is in just a few slides. So Unpaywall also have an API and client services for monitoring OA. Institutions really should make good use of it. It's very, very fast. And I think you can make something like 10,000 requests a day. So lots of data that could be coming your way. Unpaywall is fast becoming the best source of identifying OA information for a publication. It's very easy to use and the data is very robust. Their API is free to use and it operates on exactly the same principles as those that we've just discussed. So now we move on to our last section, which is the results of our research that we published in the journal Publications early this year. So this formed part of a special issue on open access put together by the British Library. So these were loosely the aims of the project, and we've already touched on some of these already. We wanted to create an OA classification schemes to interpret our data. So we largely built upon the work by Unpaywall here, but with some differences as I just discussed. We wanted to investigate possible OA locations, and for that we decided to use Sherpa REF. We also wanted to investigate OA locations and plot the geolocation of Brunel works. We discussed this earlier on. And we wanted to investigate OA locations and volume, particularly using Unpaywall. So in our research, we liken this approach to the metaphor of the telescope, looking outward from our institution to systems beyond, which form a collaborative OA universe. So getting into it now, our results show a multitude of OA locations and activity brought about through research collaboration that intersect with our institution. The key finding from the Sherpa REF data was that there were 34 total OA scenarios for authors. And if you follow the link on this slide, you can have a look at our data. So a significant number of titles adapt to 8 possible OA scenarios. And we think what this shows is the scale of possible OA locations available to authors when making dissemination decisions for their research. So this example that we cite in the paper is the OA dissemination options for the Journal of Applied Physics. So as you can see here, it has up to 13 open access scenarios, and not counting when you have multiple authors possibly considering different OA routes. So the complexities and range of publisher policies combined with funder and institutional policies may create opportunities for duplication in OA locations. So I'll just touch on our discoveries for OA volume at Brunel that we found using these services. So this shows total journal articles and conference papers over the last 4 years or so. The orange colours are gold and hybrid OA. The green colours are institutional and subject repositories, and the purple and black are variants of closed access. So with a complete global record of our activity, this means our institutional services can now effectively target researchers. Our role is to provide advocacy and support. Researchers with a green OA option can be guided towards repositories. So this is shown here in this figure, the closed access works, the purple band. So for Brunel, this amounted to just 7% of papers in 2016. And that's quite important when you consider that the teams that are supporting this work are usually quite small and need to target their resources quite strategically. It also provides a spotlight on those publishers without archival policies, again, which is quite useful in terms of supporting advocacy work. And that's something that I don't really hear enough about, I think, is publishers that aren't providing these mechanisms to make their authors allow them to make their work open access. So we've seen growth at Brunel in terms of hybrid and green, which again reflects the policy landscape somewhat. But we haven't seen as much growth in the adoption of gold OA journals. This is a trend identified in UK's report. Gold OA journals only account for about 10% of the market overall. That's worth bearing in mind, I think. And just to end this section, I'll touch on our results which is the theme of our presentation in terms of the replication and multiplicity of OA works for Brunel. So in our sample, we found that most gold works are found in other locations irrespective of the publishing license. So we found about 30% of gold and hybrid works were available under a bronze model. So this graph here shows that green is without a doubt the most popular form of OA at our institution, but it's quite interesting to note that it doesn't really have very much replication. This is a sort of variant of that graph, average OA locations. Gold and hybrid, on the other hand, do have a lot of replication. So on average, gold is replicated in 3 locations, hybrid is replicated at least twice. Again, some interesting findings, but I'll finish it off there and just hand back over to Chris for the final section of the talk.
Thank you very much, David. So I'll just finish because I realise we're a bit short of time. What our results show, I think, at the broadest level is it highlights a tension between the reality of research as a quite highly collaborative enterprise with partnerships that cross institutional and territorial boundaries, and also the requirements of nationally focused policies, which tend to force institutions to monitor their OA compliance narrowly through their own local institutional systems. So as we've discussed, this is potentially at odds with a transforming and multifaceted open science environment, which comprises of a vast network of repositories, social systems, and open initiatives by new and long-standing publishers. And these are not necessarily captured very well by local systems. I think this excellent graphic by Kramer and Bosman demonstrates the complexity of the scholarly communications landscape and the options open to academics. The results of our research therefore point to the need for interoperability between local systems and emerging open science services, which are attempting to aggregate this kind of very varied open access activity. Such enhanced data may then help to transform the policy landscape and incentivize researcher or discipline-specific activities surrounding open scholarship, and possibly lead to quite a lot of innovation if that was the case. So just to touch on very, very briefly, just to finish with, because I know I want to get on to questions, is the future. And something that was announced last week was Plan F by the European Union, Plan S by the European Union. And before we finish, I think it's quickly worth mentioning this. Plan S aims to put in place by 2020 a policy whereby publicly funded research must be published in a compliant OA journal or platform. Interestingly, UKRI has signed up to this, so we are assuming these principles are going to apply to the UK. And there are 10 principles to this plan, which I've noted down, some of them here. A few things that stood out was that it's a short time implementation, just over a year. It's quite loaded terminology used here, using the term high quality journals. How are they going to determine this? Interesting to see that there's action on hybrid, which is a model we've seen a massive growth in, and is also very controversial, of course. And the interesting that they mention a publication fees cap. So how's this going to be set? That's the question. And as I said, this is really just developing in the last week, but already there's been a number of people who've commented on it, such as John Tennant and Martin Eve. Both are generally supportive of the plan, with Eve concluding that Plan S is a bold, radical vision for the future of scholarly publishing. It adopts a deliberately interventionist strategy designed to allow the players to call the piper's tune. However, Eve does wonder, as you'll see in the quote here, the second quote on this slide, wonder how they would decide on the publication fee cap. He also wonders what this will mean for green OA policies, so think of that of Research England, for example. Similarly, John Tennant notes that Plan S does not show much recognition for a complex OA ecosystem, which is something that we've mentioned. And we broadly agree in general sense that Plan S is a bold initiative, especially in terms of trying to curb some publisher practices around hybrid, which have become unsustainable for institutions and in particular libraries. A couple of other questions that emerged for us was that we thought this was looking at Plan S initially, that it's very science focused, doesn't seem to take into account arts and humanities and practices in those disciplines, but it's going to apply to monographs at some point. So this may ultimately shake up scholarly publishing in this area. Still quite top down, it's still quite compliance focused. You know, where's the incentive to engage in cultural shifts around open practices that go beyond just journal article publishing? And it's positive that this is one regional policy, however, with a consortium of national funders signed up. It's an improvement on there being lots of localized ones. But the question is what does this mean for these local policies, these national level policies? So that's the point where we will leave it and hand over to Maria to see if there's any questions from the floor.
Thank you very much, Chris and David. That was a really interesting, presentation. And David, in particular, you're very game, giving us a live presentation, a live demo of the system. And it's always so much better to see it live. We're going to go to a couple of questions that came in before the webinar. We'll start off with those. One question was, how widespread is it that institutional libraries are going to non-traditional sources of metadata as described here? Is that an ongoing trend, do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a growing trend. I mean, there are other research papers that have been published by other researchers in different parts of the world. Notably, there was one by the Bosman and Kramer team, actually. I can't remember where they're based, actually. They very recently did a study of Dutch universities, OA levels, using Unpaywall data. Because that data is recently available in Web of Science and now Scopus as well, it's still worth, even though this data is becoming more available, accessible through these sort of traditional services that we're all familiar with in terms of assessing large chunks of data from institutions or bits of the world. It's worth bearing in mind that, particularly with Scopus, the implementation of services like Unpaywall is certainly not necessarily being done completely objectively. So, for example, the Unpaywall data in Scopus is, for the time being, only geared toward gold and hybrid publications. They're not actually sourcing the data for the green and other types of OA. So it's worth bearing in mind. Again, the data that comes from those systems is also quite hierarchical. So it's necessary, because OA publication is so dynamic, with all these variances of versions that are available. So it tends to sort of apply an OA classification on a sort of best available version. So we'll tend to go for, if there's a gold version, it will sort of tick it as gold. But if you actually access the APIs directly, you have full access to all the versions, all the data that's available. So it's definitely worth getting to grips with the API if you're looking for sort of more perhaps nuanced questions in terms of exactly what OA activity is happening within your institutions or within your domains.
Excellent, thank you, David. The next question was, is identifying open access versus identifying OA that can be freely reused important? So the way they're phrasing it was, how many levels of open access are relevant? So the different variants, I guess.
Yes, absolutely. I think this sort of harks very much back to the way that the Unpaywall guys framed their classifications in their study. So they very much sort of, are in line with what Budapest and other sort of initiatives say in terms of open access is simply a paper that's available, under those terms. It's necessary for practitioners to derive sort of subtypes from that in terms of, is it a publisher, is it a repository? And from their paper also, they felt it was necessary to derive a new subtype in terms of bronze OA, which specifically speaks to your point about publisher versions being available in terms of reusable licenses. So in the UK, that's been a particularly heavy focus. Funders have really very much been sort of advocating and requiring very open licenses for research that they're funding. But as that global study showed, currently the most popular form of publisher OA is bronze by far. So lots of publishers do seem to be retaining rights to those works. whilst making them open access? I think it's a very interesting question that sort of needs further exploration. And I guess in terms of analysing what's happening within your own institutions, I think it's very important to analyse whether works do have a licence and what that variance of licences. We weren't able to get into this, there wasn't time in our slides, but there is in our paper. We looked at all the licence data that was returned by the Unpaywall service, and Core also, I think, has some licence information as well. And we were able to find that about 30% of our papers were available as bronze, but CC-BY was the dominant licence. Otherwise, CC-BY and CND was the second most common. But again, these are questions that aren't really being asked, I think, at a sort of bigger, a higher level, a national context, a global context. I think we need to be trying to find out why authors are choosing more restrictive licenses, possibly, or why publishers are restricting the licenses that they're offering to researchers. So I think, yes, in answer to your question, I think it's a very, very important area that we certainly need to investigate, I think. And I guess as practitioners at an institutional level, we're best placed perhaps to be deriving some of those answers from our researchers and looking at sort of discipline-specific issues, I think, with regard to that.
Excellent, thank you. In fact, that brings us to the end of our questions for this session. So I'd like to thank everyone who asked the question for the interesting array, and obviously for the interesting responses from our speakers. Chris and David, it sounds like you have your work cut out for you and you shouldn't give up research studies just yet. It sounds like there's a way to go.
Yeah, thank you very
much. So we are going to post the slides after the webinar, and we'll also send out the recording link within about 24 hours for those of you who perhaps wish to review the session. I'd like to thank all the participants today, and of course thank the speakers. So Chris and David, thank you very much.
Thanks very much for coming.
Thank you.
And when you do complete your next study, do get in touch again, and we'll do it all again, as they say.
Sounds good.
So at the very end of the webinar, there will be a survey, and I'd be most grateful if you could all complete that so that we can improve these webinars in response to your feedback. The next webinar is in October on the Think, Check, Submit campaign. And in the meantime, until then, I'd just like to thank you again and to wish you all a very nice rest of the day. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.